Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us throughout what I hope has been such an interesting and fruitful day. We'll do a proper summing up at the end of this, but I want to get on with this next panel on the subject of ESG, woke capitalism, net zero, a big umbrella term for, well, anything we can consider in the bucket of green stuff, lefty stuff, all that kind of stuff. And is it as bad as some say, or are there ways in which it's okay? To many, these are three of the greatest enemies of free markets today, setting in course an aggressively regulatory, anti-competitive and anti-prosperity approach to environmentalism and decarbonisation. So we are going to explore how we can deliver decarbonisation and green policy and industrial policy in a free market-friendly way, or indeed whether we can do that at all. And I'd love to have as many questions on the floor on that subject as possible. Hopefully in this session, we'll get closer to the answers to questions like whether net zero is the best way to decarbonise the economy, how we can cut the cost of energy for businesses and individuals without increasing subsidy or regulation, as Robert Jenrick alluded to this morning, and how we can actually discover and reach the next technological frontier, which will deliver greater productivity and prosperity for all, especially without the dead hand of ESG and all the associated nasties forcing good money into bad places. The last thing we want is to have all of your pensions and ISAs thrown down investments like canals, and by the time you retire, they're not worth anything. So I'd like to invite our panelists to take their seats on the stage. If you can just go take the seat right in front of you, and I will introduce you all. That way. Righto, thank you very much. So, our first speaker today is Ryan Whitten, who is sitting in the middle, and I first have to make an apology entirely on my fault, which is I booked Ryan for the wrong session this morning, which is why he appears in a different session in the hard copies of the agenda, but thankfully his expertise is so good on this area, I moved him here, and hopefully there's been no hard feelings. So Ryan is one of the most interesting writers on economic and industrial policy today. He's an analyst at Bismarck and Analysis, the California-based advisory firm, whose Bismarck brief I certainly suggest you read or look at the free version. It's always very, very interesting. Ryan has built a reputation for producing some of the most perceptive and thoughtful pieces on the structural problems facing the British economy today and how they can be resolved. Perhaps slightly less of a free marketeer and a libertarian than many of us in the room, Ryan does actually believe in the role that the state can play in economic growth, which is quite controversial to a few of you here, I'm sure. He is a rising star, expert in energy policy, the challenges facing British industry, and crucially, how those challenges can be overcome. Our second speaker is Sam Richards, the founder of Britain Remade. He is our greenest and likely least hostile speaker to ESG, and certainly least hostile to net zero today. Sam is a former advisor to Boris Johnson and previously ran the Conservative Environment Network, and I can think of few better advocates for free market approach to climate policy and energy in Britain today. Britain Remade has campaigned on how to reduce the cripplingly high costs of building new energy infrastructure, like nuclear power plants, and they've even campaigned to make it easier to build roads, which certainly sets Britain Remade apart from many of the other green organisations. They're in the midst of waging a very interesting campaign against the Welsh Government, which for those of you who are visiting from overseas might not realise, the Welsh Government has banned road building on green reasons. And right now, Britain Remade are fighting the fight against them. Today, Sam is here to offer his thoughts on how to cut the cost of energy, which is one of the most important issues facing the British economy, and it'll be interesting to ask him his views on where this fits with the wider issues around ESG and net zero. Our third speaker is Karl Williams. He is Research Director at the Centre for Policy Studies and is on a one-man mission to keep the spirit and vision of Norman Tebbit alive for the future of British conservatism, his political hero. A data specialist who worked in the city covering energy and seaborne trade before his move into public policy, Karl has, to my mind, led the CPS's recent research into incredibly important territory. He focuses on two arguably existential issues for facing Britain, which are mass immigration and our dysfunctional energy policy. Two things we've talked about quite a lot today, particularly in the morning, but obviously we'll focus on energy this afternoon. The CPS recently published a mammoth paper on the problems of British regulation, which charts nearly a decade of government regulation. Remember how the Tories repeatedly tell us that they are a deregulatory party? Well, his paper shows otherwise, and he recently examined the poor quality ways in which this regulatory culture has developed, and we are so grateful to have Karl here today and to hear more about this kind of work he's been doing. And our final speaker, Pieter Cleppe. Pieter has come to London to give us the latest reports from occupied Europe. Pieter is the editor-in-chief of Brussels Report, one of the most important centre-right and free market news outlets in Brussels. I encourage you all to read it. And he helped organise the first free market roadshow event this year, which began in Brussels in March. So it's a great pleasure to invite him to the concluding session of the roadshow today. Pieter has written on the troubles facing the European economy, particularly in the realms of net zero, green policy and regulation. Look at the rural revolts taking place against a new round of farming regulations, not just in Holland, but in France, the spiritual home of the European Union, and the continental's famous agricultural powerhouse. European Parliament elections are on the horizon, and it'll be interesting to hear from Pieter whether he thinks these issues will play a role in the populist backlash many expect to see coming. In one sense, Pieter's visit to Gartum is a homecoming today, as in the 2010s he worked for Open Europe and helped with the campaign for Britain to escape occupied Europe. He's now gone back behind enemy territory and will bring Belgium freedom in the near future, I'm sure. So without further ado, I would like to kick things off with Ryan, and then I will come back to the lectern to field questions after everyone's spoken. Thank you very much. Ryan.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Fred, and thanks for highlighting my statist credentials to this buccaneering audience. To the extent I'm a statist, I'm very much an upstream statist. I think when it comes to the broad topic of energy, it's worth outlining what the current plan is. And for this, you need to go look at the energy system operators outline for net zero by 2050. In very simple terms, when we're looking at their consumer transformation scenario, we're anticipating that home heating, transport and industry is heavily electrified, and about 80% of this electricity is coming from offshore wind, solar and onshore wind, with quite a small amount from nuclear. Now, depending on different scenarios, there's also a significant place for hydrogen in this strategy. Now, what is this 2050 roadmap based on in terms of what Britain's economy is going to look like in 2050? Well, the average growth rate that they're anticipating, taken from, I think it's London Economics or Capital Economics, one of them, is about 1.5%. So that's anticipating basically that we remain on this quite sluggish growth trajectory right up until 2050. As a strategy, it's basically not anticipating that Britain can become significantly more prosperous, that we can't have a renaissance in growth, that we're basically stuck on this course and our energy system has to reflect that. Talking to the people at the ESO, these were incredibly intelligent people, but they didn't seem to have any, how should we say, notion that we should be trying to build the energy system for what we want, rather than trying to get to net zero in the fastest possible time with the least amount of energy consumed. And we can see that there's some quite restrictive assumptions that they're making. For example, they're only anticipating that data centers will take up 30 terawatt hours of electricity around 2050. The answer could be close to 100 terawatt hours. The significant problem with data centers is that they can be built very quickly. Demand can be added far more quickly than capacity can be brought on to accommodate it. And Ireland's finding that, Britain's finding that, companies in the United States are finding that. And so this very restrictive plan that we have, I think, greatly imperils our ability to have a significant, fast-growing economy in the future. And I think this particularly relates to where we are now with our energy-intensive industries and with manufacturing. So just bear with me for a second. Yes. Industrial electricity prices in the UK are among the highest in the developed world. Far higher than in the United States, far higher than in Iceland, far higher than in Japan, far higher than in Korea, even higher than in Germany. Industrial electricity costs in 2023 were 240% what they were in 2010, and that's after accounting for inflation. This isn't a problem for industrial strategy. This is effectively a veto on industrial strategy. You can't really have a biotech hub, in whatever part of the country you want, with energy costs like this. They also track very, very well with our productivity puzzle, right? As energy costs have increased greatly, so our productivity has stagnated. We talk a lot about automation. Britain has very few robots per manufacturing workers. A big part of this is because automation is incredibly risky. It fails very often, and generally leads to, lopping off the heads of various vice presidents. And so you've got to have a certain degree of slack in your operating margins in order to accommodate it. If we think about Airbus, a very successful aerospace company of which Britain is still an incredibly important member, in 2023 it had operating margins of about 6%, Rolls-Royce about 5%. When we think about really strategic companies like Brewdog, they're actually on an operating loss. And a big part of that is because of very high energy costs. So essentially, it's not working at the moment. Now, what's to blame for that? Is it very high gas prices? We have been told, and there has been a lot of compelling evidence, it seems, that renewables offer cheap generation rates, and this translates into cheaper energy costs. I'm afraid that, from my perspective, it's not quite that easy, right? We've heard that, for example, offshore wind can be 9 times cheaper than gas. Currently, the sort of reference market rate for gas is about sort of £80 per megawatt hour. If we look at April 2024, we had about 268 million paid out to the average strike prices of 146 megawatts per hour for offshore wind, right? So if the disastrous Hinkley C power plant had actually been operating today, it would be cheaper than the average of our offshore wind fleet. And we could make nuclear a lot cheaper. In very basic terms, looking at 2023, if we factor in the feed-in tariffs, the contracts for difference payments, and the renewable obligation certificates, as well as the increasing network costs, we're looking at about 10 to 12 billion in terms of subsidies to the offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar industry every year. In 2021, the subsidies were about 6 billion. If we look at, say, 2023, with those three industries, their turnover is about 23 billion, with a workforce of about 27,000. And if we take the 12 billion subsidies, that's about 52% of their turnover being subsidies. So I think, there is an argument that government regulation is hurting the development of offshore wind, but I really don't think that the free market is what's driving these intermittent renewables and why they're so preferred. If we look at globally, utility scale renewable electricity capacity in North America, China, Asia Pacific, the vast majority of primary drivers for those different installations are government-led, either through fixed tariffs and premiums, auctions, tax credits, or the fact that they're owned by public utilities. So, we often talk about the government getting in the way, but from what I'm seeing, the government's actually being incredibly generous to these energy sources. And I think in the long term, unless we can find some real efficiencies in grid upgrades, which themselves cost estimates of hundreds of billions, I think that the ESO's 2050 net zero plan will not just be very restrictive from our growth perspective, it will actually cost a lot of money, and that will add further restrictions. And I think we can see this most obviously in the increased interest among energy-intensive corporate buyers for nuclear energy. And people will talk a lot about, Amazon and like Meta and so forth. But I would actually look closer at Novo Nordisk. This is obviously a very vigorous and muscular audience, so none of you will have heard of Wegovy, but they are the developers of semaglutide, which is very good for biting into the obesity crisis, I suppose. Anyway, the head of their foundation, Lars Rebien Sørensen, says this, and keep in mind that Denmark is the primary driver of offshore wind. It's really an area that they're very strong in. It's penetrated those markets even more than the UK. He says, in my opinion, the excessive focus on offshore wind has some worrying and unfortunate effects, which could end up costing both consumers and Danish society immensely. Now, Denmark has been a very anti-nuclear state for some time, but essentially the most powerful industrialist in that country is now pushing quite hard to introduce the discussion in the country of actually bringing nuclear on board. Now, I don't necessarily think that it's got to be either or, but I think if we are going to develop a low carbon future and energy abundance at the same time, I think that we have to rejig our estimates for what we can do with intermittence, and we need to base our energy strategy around baseload firm power in the form of nuclear. That's, I think, where I'm sort of at this point. And yeah, that does me in.
Thanks very much, Ryan. I think there's actually quite a lot that we're going to agree on, but there are a few things that I want to pick up on. So as part of our campaign, Britain Remade, I've been speaking to folk across the country. I've spoken to people in a blizzard on the port of Blythe and people in a surprisingly sunny city centre, Birmingham. I've been in pubs in Wolverhampton and Warrington. I've spent a lot of time in the pub, is what I'm trying to say, actually, as part of this campaign. But what has been the number one concern from every family, from every business across the country? It has been the cost of energy. And just to build on the points that I know that you've already heard many times today, but it cannot be overstated just how important secure and abundant energy is to economic growth. The Industrial Revolution, or even the Thatcher boom, can be explained by it, and every sector of the economy, from traditional manufacturing through to the modern data centres that will have in years to come, rely on it. Without abundant energy, we cannot deliver high standard of living today, let alone growth tomorrow. So what then is behind the high costs of energy that Ryan talked about? Well, it is the case that last year our bills were driven up 200% by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We had got to the point where we were reliant on foreign powers and, well, the impact that they could have on international gas markets to keep the lights on. And before we go any further, I do actually want to just address one of the points that Ryan raised around the differences in strike prices between the average costs of those legacy renewables that are on the grid versus the cost of gas. It is really worth bearing in mind that those prices, it is absolutely the case. We are paying for the subsidies that we gave to renewables 20 years ago. But if we were to build new renewables now, they would be significantly cheaper to bring online and would not require that level of subsidy. So there is an element of comparing apples and oranges there, because you are comparing the cost of gas today with the cost that renewables were 20 years ago, not with the cost of building new renewables now. And it is also worth saying that the price shock that we felt, that 200% increase in our bills, would have been significantly greater if we did not have those renewables and the nuclear power plants, the wind farms and the solar panels, all hooked up to the grid. So our push for net zero, which, you know, by the way, and this may be something that we'll come to, our push to net zero has not prevented us from attempting to drain the North Sea dry. We have a policy of maximum economic recovery. There have been no wells that we've been stopped from attempting to drill as a result of net zero. But what it has done is, because we've started building wind farms and solar panels and nuclear power stations, it's meant that we're not as exposed to international gas prices. And you can see the importance of having domestic, secure, clean, cheap, abundant energy in what's happened in France. France was in part insulated from the energy crisis because of their fleet of nuclear reactors. But to step back then, what then are the structural problems? If, as I say, it is not our push to net zero that underpins our high cost of energy, and I totally agree on the need, just how central bringing down the cost of energy is to future prosperity. What then underpins our high cost of energy? The problem is our broken planning system and the web of red tape that currently binds up the builders of new sources of power. Our energy crisis was a result of the fact that it's far too hard to build new nuclear power stations, new wind farms, new solar farms, and also new grid connections. So on nuclear, we split the atom in this country, and yet it's been 29 years since we have built a new nuclear power station. But this shouldn't be a surprise when it took Hinkley 6 years to begin building after applying for planning permission, and they had to write a 30,000 page environmental impact assessment for a green source of power. Now, I wanted to just go into this a little bit. So one of the areas of this environmental impact assessment was related to fish. We all love fish. But Hinkley points, so they have to go through all these different stages. Their water intake had to be redesigned to take in water at a lower velocity to give the fish a better chance of swimming away. They had to set up a fish recovery system. Unclear what that is, but they had to set up a fish recovery system. And then on top of that, they were required to install an acoustic fish deterrent, 288 speakers to produce a racket to save, wait for it, 112 fish. Clearly, this is a disproportionate regulation on building one of the greenest sources of power. And they had a comparatively easy ride through the planning system compared to what is coming for Sizewell C, the next big nuclear power station, whose environmental impact assessment stands at almost 45,000 pages. The system is not fit for purpose. And you see this right across the energy system. Offshore wind farms take 13 years to get up and running, when actually building the things takes 2. Onshore wind, banned in England. And the tragedy is, of course, that this planning system that is stopping us building green sources of energy is also failing to protect nature. Every key biodiversity indicator in England, from farmland birds to insect life, is in decline under the current knot of red tape. It's got to be possible to design a new planning regime that allows us to build stuff faster and then divert some of the proceeds from that building into habitat restoration, into protecting nature. Now, I don't know, we may hear from others on the panel around this, we may hear this in questions, but I do just want to address the fact that I'm sure that some will say, well, the problem is that we're turning our back on fossil fuels too soon. We're going too far too fast. And that actually, rather than relying on these windmills, we should be making the most of the North Sea. We should be going for fracking. As I say, we currently are making the most of the North Sea. We have this policy of maximum economic recovery. There are no policies in place that are currently preventing us from taking any more from the North Sea. It is a declining basin, and unfortunately, we have to live with that fact. And then secondly, on fracking, we tried the best part of a decade to get fracking up and running. Unfortunately, as Conservatives, we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we'd like it to be. The UK is not Montana. It does not have the geology or the geography or the population density to support the thousands of fracking pads that would be necessary to even make a dent in UK's demand for gas. The future is to get clean, abundant energy rolling in the UK. Wind farms, solar panels, and those nuclear power stations. The US state that's had the fastest rollout of wind and solar, it's not the hippies in California, it's the great state of Texas. China has invested more in new wind and solar last year than the rest of the world combined. Now, these characters are not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing this because they see the competitive advantage, which, by the way, on a tangential note, is exactly what the Chinese are doing on electric vehicle manufacturing, where they see the competitive advantage in trying to corner the market. So the good news, as I say, is that there is a road ahead to both energy abundance and doing our bit to tackle climate change. And it involves the supply side reforms needed to cut the red tape and allowing us to get building. And with that mention of supply side reforms, it is worth mentioning, it is worth remembering that the first world leader to raise climate change at the United Nations was, of course, Margaret Thatcher. As a chemist, she understood the science. And as Conservatives, we should not shy away from our record in tackling climate change, and that includes setting the net zero target and making progress towards it. So here's what I hope, and what I think that the next debate, the debate on energy over the next Parliament, can look like. A socialist government that is going to look to ban and to regulate and to tax us back to the Stone Age with this new state-run energy company that is not going to cut our bills, is not going to cut emissions, is not going to deliver energy security. And a free market, conservative opposition that understands the science of climate change, but also backs the supply-side reforms needed to deliver clean energy abundance that will cut pollution, but also put rocket boosters under the economy. Thank you.
Right, so I want to address 3 points today as part of this rubric. firstly, I'm going to talk about the broader growth of the regulatory state in Britain. That's key for understanding the context of ESG. Secondly, I'm going to look at how net zero as an industrial strategy intersects with the regulatory state and how that's driving trends in economic growth. And then finally, I will turn to energy policy and its implications for growth. And I'm going to have some choice words for Sam as well, I think, over fracking in the North Sea. So, regulation. The CPS recently published a paper, The Future of Regulation, by our former research director, Tom Clofferty. And in this paper, we went back and looked at every single official impact assessment for 3,528 pieces of primary legislation passed between 2010 and 2019 and totted up the costs. And we found that the regulatory burden added to businesses in gross terms was 35 billion per annum, plus 40 billion in one-off transition costs. And when you take into account the supposed benefits of much of this regulation, it's still translated to a net annual cost of business of 6 billion in today's money. So that's equivalent to adding about 2 pence to the rate of corporation tax. It's also important to note that this is a massive underestimate of the cost of the regulatory state for various reasons. Firstly, most of the impact assessments were filled out by junior civil servants, post-facto rationalisation decisions already made. You see this in the way that the cost estimates cluster around the 10 million or 100 million or 1 billion mark. So back of the fag packet calculations, no real detail to it. Ministers generally wouldn't even read the impact assessments. Then you have the fact that Treasury exempted itself from impact assessments. That's a huge chunk of economic activity that no benchmarking whatsoever. Several thousand pieces of EU legislation transposed into UK law, no impact assessment. Nothing at all on secondary legislation, which is pretty vital. I mean, one very topical piece of secondary legislation was the amendment to the 2008 Climate Change Act in 2019, which committed us to net zero. And I will return to the costings around that shortly, because whilst there wasn't an impact assessment, there were some costings. And also, the quality of the impact assessments was terrible. So for MiFID II, massive piece of financial regulation, the net benefit, the headline figure was estimated at £105.20. Once you dug down to the details of the report, you see actually it was a net cost, so they got the sign wrong, of £105.2 million. So very basic numerical errors, underpinning notionally as Fred mentioned earlier, a government that was committed to deregulation and repealing red tape. Now, what this represents is a vast gradual accretion of new laws, laws that increase compliance costs through staff, through lawyers, through professional services, which create barriers to entry, which inhibit competition, which slow innovation, which fundamentally actually inculcate risk aversion across key parts of the economy, particularly the city, more broadly. And the growth of the regulatory state, I suppose, is a step change from how the British state tried to manage the economy from, say, the 1940s to the 1970s, which was Keynesian demand management, price and incomes policy, nationalise the commanding heights of the economy. These days, we still have a little bit of that, but primarily we use regulations to attempt to achieve social, ideological outcomes divorced from any concept of economic efficiency or growth. Which brings us on to, nicely, net zero as an industrial strategy, and I'm going to argue against Ryan here a bit. Net zero is not a veto on industrial strategy. It is itself an industrial strategy. It's just not a very good one, fundamentally. And I think the essence of it, there's two main parts. The first is net zero is a structural de-intensification of energy consumption across the economy in a way which has never been attempted before, certainly in the modern developed world. You are moving to a less dense source of energy, unless, of course, we commit to the full nuclear route, which would be great, I would hope to see. But I'm sceptical that's going to happen anytime soon, sadly, and I would not be surprised to see rolling blackouts by the end of the decade. And the other component of it is, of net zero as an industrial strategy, is essentially marching society towards a particular goal. So in Oakeshottian terms, you're moving us from being a association society to a civic society towards being transforming from a civic to an enterprise association. In Hayek, in terms of from cosmos to taxis, emergent order, spontaneous growth to design a system, essentially a command and control economy. And I'd use the command and control words very deliberately there. Because the best analogy route to net zero, I think, is the Second World War. In 2019, the Climate Change Commission and the Treasury both did very rough estimates for what they thought the cost of reaching net zero would be. 1.5 trillion and 2.1 trillion. If you average those and look at that as a share of 2019 GDP, that was 83% of GDP. Fighting the Second World War cost 84% of 1939 GDP. So that's the sort of magnitude of the enterprise being undertaken. We can do net zero, but it's going to cost us the equivalent of fighting a global total war against 3 rival great powers. And returning to the point about how we now go about controlling the economy, yes, we are setting prices a bit. There's the energy price cap, which has been disastrous for the retail market, for consumers and for companies. There are elements of subsidy. We're dismantling our virgin steelmaking capacity, subsidising battery factories in Somerset and so on. Primarily, though, it's regulations and targets being used to move us towards 2050. The series of intermediate targets for heat pumps, for EVs, for building standards, wood-fired stoves. Less so here, but agriculture, we can certainly see the direction of travel in Ireland and Denmark, in the Netherlands there. And at the same time, I think this is where I want to return to what Sam was saying. Yes, we do have notionally the goal that we want to recover as much as possible from the North Sea, but governments for the last 10 years have just delivered punishment beating after punishment beating to North Sea operators. Most recently, the windfall tax, which is taking corporation tax in the North Sea up to 75%. And yes, it is a mature declining basin, but there's new frontier fields out west of Shetland. Rosebank would have been one of the hubs here. And no wonder investors are very reluctant to actually commit to the very high upfront costs of these projects, given the uncertain fiscal regime, which I'm sure is only going to get a lot worse under Labour. If we're talking about terrible regulations, there's also fracking. So Codrilla's PNR2 appraisal well was shut down mid-operation because the surface vibrations reached 8.2 millimeters per second in the point particle velocity measures. The standards we actually apply to other parts of the UK economy, construction, coal mining, etc., it's 15 millimeters per second. So we kneecapped shell explosion straight from the go. And actually, I think if you even take the lowest estimates of the ultimate recoverable commercial resource there, we could have been basically energy independent within 5 years. And I think that's a great missed opportunity. And that is coming out of sort of a risk-adverse regulatory approach to energy policy. And it's not just the material projects and products we have to consider, it's what's going upstream of that. So ESG regulations, access to capital, government interference like the green taxonomy, what counts as a green fuel. And therefore, if you are one of the companies that now specialises in green kite marks and certification, you pay attention to that. And then the active investors downstream of that say, well, if this company doesn't have this right stamp from our approved NGO or commercial company, then how can you possibly invest in them? And then the students at Oxford and Cambridge colleges got a lever to pull when they want to get their colleges to divest from oil and gas or whatever else. And this is obviously bad for energy security and energy production because you've got resources being misallocated to meet ideological goals. And of course it's bad for investors too because they're investing in things that will have a lower return on investment. So again, I think we return to ESG as a picture example of how we are creating regulations, giving jobs to basically pen pushers, creating an atmosphere that is averse to innovation, to risk, to entrepreneurship. And we can see that a lot of this is not driven by commercial considerations, by comparing the behaviour of the European super majors versus the American ones. So Total, BP, Shell went much more heavily into green investments in the late 2010s, early 2020s, in contrast to Chevron and Exxon. And then, of course, 2022 energy crisis walked back quite fast and are now breaking, oil and gas is a big part of the transition. So it was reputation and PR, partly or maybe largely induced by government regulations, which created an atmosphere previously where they were investing suboptimally. And I think that brings us to the final point I want to make, which is around energy and economic growth. So since 2010, the US economy has increased in size by 37%, the UK by 24%, Eurozone by 19%. Obviously, there's lots of factors at play here combining, but I think the crucial difference between the European-US divergence is energy costs. We've already heard quite a lot about this. Fracking revolution turned America into an energy exporter in oil and gas for the first time in decades. Energy feeds through into every part of the economy, as we heard. And it's not just reducing costs of electricity. Actually, the effects of cheap and abundant hydrocarbons are far more profound than that. Boom in fertilizer plants and therefore cheap agriculture, cheap consumer goods. Boom in plastics, pet chems. Boom in glass, ceramics, cement, steel, i.e. cheaper construction costs. And therefore, if you do want to do a green energy transition, it's much easier to do if you've got very low electricity costs at the factory, very low build costs, a generally more conducive atmosphere to investment in anything, lower levels of risk appetite. And in Britain, I think we have slightly done the wrong thing in that we've tried to leap straight from a fossil fuel economy to a net zero economy rather than taking a more gradual route on the way through. And so much of that is downstream of the regulatory approach to energy policy, which I think in many ways has overstepped the mark and is not the right one. And I think my theory is that the growth of the regulatory state means at the moment we are locked onto a suboptimal path for energy policy and economic growth for the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much. So a lot of the green policies in place in the United Kingdom today are, of course, dating back from the period when the UK was still a member of the EU. So I would say, when I'll give you the picture in mainland Europe, a lot of it will be similar. Now, the original idea of the EU is to have open markets, but somehow when it comes to energy, that was never really properly implemented. I mean, to be frank, energy markets pretty much all across the world are deeply crony or never properly liberalized. But certainly in the EU, that was also always the case. Even when you look at nuclear power, there were lots of complicated procedures. The European Commission itself was for a long time an obstacle to nuclear power, despite the fact that there's a treaty, the Euratom Treaty, which requires the European Commission to promote nuclear power. I mean, from a technology nuclear perspective, I wouldn't support that, but just to give you an idea how deep the anti-nuclear bias was, because this has thankfully changed in the last few years, with even at COP, I forgot which number it was, in Dubai, the climate policy community embracing nuclear power, which I think was a great thing. Secondly, the idea was to have no subsidies. But then in the EU climate policies, kindly taken over by the British, there was not just the expectation to reduce CO2 emission, which would be fair enough, but also to have minimum targets in terms of certain energy sources, renewable energy sources, whereby your renewable was already defined in a shady way, with, I'll come to that, biomass taking basically the most of the percentage of the renewable, and biomass entails wood shipping from half across the world to Europe and burning it over here. So there's a lot of scientists also from the left of the spectrum that I think rightfully challenge this. And it just shows that it's very tricky for any government, any authority to start micromanaging the good, or to start declaring these are the good, these are the bad technology. So that's definitely what we had. And then thirdly, also, there was no real privatization. You could say there was some kind of open market, or there's some kind of open market in Europe. A state company from France can come on the Belgian market, but often we're not talking about real private companies. The hand of the state is very strongly visible. So this was like sort of the situation in 2019. When Ursula von der Leyen was promoted away from Berlin to Brussels by Angela Merkel to become European Commission President, and together with her deputy Frans Timmermans, the Dutch Commissioner, the Climate Commissioner, they came up with the European Green Deal. What I'll do now is to give you an overview of the kind of measures that have been decided in the context of the European Green Deal that have caused so much anger, not only with farmers, but also with industry from Germany, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from the energy-intense parts of the European economy, raising the alarm and nobody really caring, even if we have European Parliament elections on the 9th of June. So the first measure was to increase the ambitions from 50% to 55% reduction of CO2 targets by 2030 in comparison with 1990 levels. So then they can also come up with a new target for 2040. So I mean, they never stop. There's targets coming every single year, and it's never too clear how binding they are, and even if they're binding, whether this will actually be applied. So it's almost a perversion of the law, but that's definitely a very important measure. Then new requirement for construction products under the label of the circular economy. Mandatory building renovation, very important. This caused a lot of anger in Italy, Germany, and a number of EU member states who already have this in place. What it entails is that if you buy a house, you have to upgrade the isolation standard to a certain level, even if it's not financially viable for you, but you have to do that supposedly for the climate. Despite the protest, this made it through the Council of EU member states. Nevertheless, then very important, farming. They had to drop a lot of their plans there because of the massive protest, which you've probably been following. But still, the idea is extra nitrogen restrictions. So in Holland last year, there was a big provincial election where the Farmers' Party became the biggest party of the country. And this was because of the nitrogen restrictions for Dutch agriculture. Now, it's not just because of these specific regulations for nitrogen, but also because of the fact that old 1990s regulations that ask EU member states to designate vulnerable nature area are very, very difficult to change. So if the Netherlands say, well, look, we want to keep the same size of vulnerable area in our country, but we just want to have it a bit more inconvenient places to actually allow agriculture and industry, then even if in this case the European Commission was helpful, the European Court of Justice was not helpful. So you have this whole EU legal machinery that make sure that all these new and old environmental regulations play together and make it very, very difficult to change anything. Then they have a thing called the farm to fork strategy, which is just another round of top-down agricultural planning. I think they haven't been able to do that, but they wanted to have, for example, 25% organic production of agriculture by 2030. Which is a lot, and I think if you know a little bit about organic agriculture, nothing wrong with it. It's good quality, but of course you need a lot more land, so it's not necessarily good for the environment. Also, they have dropped their sharpening of pesticides restrictions, but then, according to Ms. von der Leyen, this is only postponed for 1 year. In that regard, we should also explain a lot of the opposition of farmers against trade deals like the one with Mercosur, the Latin American trading bloc. Now, many farmers realize that EU farmers have a export surplus, that they have actually, at the end of the day, no interest in trade wars and protectionism. But they say, look, I mean, when products are coming from Ukraine, from Latin America, in theory, even if the the product standards are compliant, in practice they're often not. And I must say that's not a completely crazy argument. For me, of course, the solution would not be to stop these foreign products, but to relax and rationalize the EU regulation. But that's how you can see that this regulation ultimately also pits the producer against trade. So that was another thing. Then, very important, they're still discussing that. They try to maybe push it before the EU Parliament elections. This is the Energy Taxation Directive, which is basically higher taxes for fossil fuels, scrap the exemption for aviation, despite the fact that flying in Europe has become more expensive. They want to increase it even more. And mentioning the original idea is of course to reduce CO2 emission, but then typically the same people that are so obsessed with these higher taxes, when you mention nuclear power to them, and then I'm talking about the Greens in Germany, Austria, Belgium, my own country, where they in the government, then they're not so interested anymore. If you suggest sort of policies that also I've been writing about together with Rod Richardson here, to instead of having this punitive approach, basically have some kind of a treaty framework where countries can join if they have climate positive policies, for example, not excessively burdening nuclear power or other CO2 neutral energy sources, that they would then enjoy lower tax arrangements. So basically, instead of the stick, the taxes, the ETS, you have the carrot. In a nutshell, this is something that is certainly not acceptable yet. So the whole approach is very punitive, and they want to continue on the current path. Then on the sidelines, because they want to, in their European Green Deal, they try to link everything, even if it's not necessarily something to do with CO2. They want to regulate forests, even if this is not really an EU competence. And especially in Scandinavia, people are very angry about that, because there they actually know forests and know how to manage forests. Then, obviously they want to throw a whole lot of cash to it. So the big subsidy game in town in Brussels is hydrogen. If you want to make a lot of money as a lobbyist, then you need to go to Brussels and lobby for hydrogen, because this is the big savior for renewables. Because wind, when the wind does not shine and the sun, when the wind does not blow and the sun does not shine, then there's always hydrogen to serve as a battery, and then they ignore that you have, I think, 80% energy cost loss. I mean, there's a former senior commission official, Samuel Forfari, professor, who wrote a whole book titled The Hydrogen Illusion. To be fair, there's also people who are believers in hydrogen, but the estimates are that they want to spend 260 billion euro a year on this so gigantic subsidy. So curious how this is going to end. Then very important is the ban on the combustion engine, and then I'll conclude. There's so much more to say, but this was a complete violation of tech neutrality, and just to give you an idea how far off the European mainstream is, this was even supported by the German Christian Democrats. Germany is the country where the combustion engine was invented. So obviously it's a bad idea to start banning EVs or something, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But I think it gives you an idea of how far off the German mainstream is when it comes to climate policy, that they even went along with that. Now it's looking like in a few years they're going to abolish that. But we're not there yet. It's still in the books, and yeah, this is all very problematic. Then, in 10 seconds, yeah, of course, similar problems what you have in the UK, that one of the biggest gas reserves in Europe and the Netherlands has just been shut down. The outgoing left-wing government was even planning to pile concrete on it, so a future government could not use the future gas reserve. This is in a context where you have the energy-intensive industry in Europe in very deep trouble. Just to give you an idea how I think people in mainland Europe still don't realize what's actually going on, because these big chemical investments, when they do not happen now, then this is a loss for 20 years or something. So I think I'll leave it there. There's so much more to say, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Righto, so I will do a couple of minutes for questions before I bring everything to a close by 5 o'clock. I want to say thank you to our excellent panelists so far for 4 very different perspectives, a comprehensive survey of the European regulatory ban-happy approach to climate policy, which seems to be doing little to actually improve the state of the environment, improve the state of agriculture or biodiversity, or solve climate change, but it seems to do a lot to deindustrialise Europe. We've had a wonderful description of the problems with British industrial policy, British regulatory policy, and some very interesting arguments from Sam about the regulatory barriers standing in the way of developing new energy, but also some points of disagreement around the cost of renewables. I want to take a couple of questions from the floor. We've got one straight up from Andrew Sabisky, first of all.
Hey, just want to ask a couple of things about where people see the transmission and distribution costs going. So at the moment, the UK annual transmission costs are now about 4 billion a year. Grid balancing is, I think, about going to be 2 billion a year roughly this year. The capacity market is another billion on top of that. So yeah, these are 7 billion a year already in indirect costs, and pretty much all of that I think should be attributed to intermittent renewables as an indirect cost. I don't think the population's got massively more distributed, but what we have done is add a huge amount of new generation offshore and in northern Scotland. The capacity market cost almost certainly should be higher because we're almost certainly not procuring enough capacity in the capacity market and we're sort of relying on warm winters to avoid blackouts. So the direct subsidies we pay through CFDs and feed-in tariffs and renewables obligation to the renewable generators are one thing, but the indirect costs are almost of the same magnitude and are on an even more radical path to increase. Which and that's now roughly speaking for the average bill, these sort of indirect costs are roughly I think about 40% to 50% of the average bill.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Andrew. Sam, what do you think of that? I don't think Ryan should answer it because the two of you are colleagues. So
a couple of points. I mean, firstly, those costs will come down significantly if we make it easier to build transmission lines, if we reduce the planning restrictions on building new grid connections. But secondly, yeah, you're right. The nature of the grid is changing and will change. And with that, there are certain costs. But there are also more benefits as you move to a more flexible grid. So, for example, Octopus Energy are able to offer tariffs whereby you get 25% off your bills if you live near a wind farm when the wind is blowing. You can charge your car for free at periods when there is abundant clean energy. So you're right, we are transitioning to a different type of grid. Some of that has more cost. It doesn't have to have the amount of cost that it's had to date, but there are also benefits to that over the old, more static system that we're moving from.
Thank you very much. Another question from the floor. Stephen Denness, and then followed by Claire Cummings.
Hello, so thank you for a very interesting discussion. It strikes me with these large energy projects that there were great visionaries, right? The national grid, going out into the North Sea, these very large long-term risks, and there were generations, repeated generations, who were up for it. So where did the short-termism come from?
Very interesting question. Start with Karl, followed by Ryan, please.
Yeah, where did the short-termism come from? A very common comment on the difference between modern British and American attitudes towards capitalism is risk appetite and risk aversion. We see this at City and the preference for punch and run allocations. The growth of the regulatory state is part of the story here, but I suppose I don't have an answer for you right now. I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think the question is a good one and deserves answering.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure that's how I'd characterise it. I mean, I don't think long-termism was really factored in when we started exploring the North Sea. I mean, we just did it as quickly as possible. We certainly didn't set up a sovereign wealth fund. We didn't tax it particularly efficiently. I don't think there was a lot of fall for. I think there was a huge amount of money to be made. It had a huge windfall in this country, which I think made privatisation much easier. And the dividends have kind of gone already. So, and then if we look maybe in France at the Mesmer plan, where they build out this enormous nuclear fleet, that's really a short-term response to the sort of catastrophe of 1973 with the oil crisis. So I think catastrophe is the driver for a lot of these great energy expansions, rather than sort of austere philosopher kings sort of coming to a conclusion. I think, on the contrary, what we have now is philosopher kings, and queens, of course, basically coming up with a very abstract understanding of where the British economy will be in 2050 that won't correspond to where we'll be if we want to be prosperous. So I'm not sure. If anything, the fact that we're thinking and trying to create this energy economy for 2050 makes short-termism not really the problem, I think.
A very interesting response, Ryan. Claire, question from the front there.
Thank you. This is a far from an abstract question, and it really is to do with my own ignorance, if you don't mind me asking. We've got all this regulation. We're saving 120 fishes, and we're saving some rare spiders. What's China doing?
Yeah.
They don't have their own airspace that they breathe, and we don't.
Quite. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. They certainly do not have our approach to biodiversity. Yeah, I mean, look, we have inherited the old European approach to site protection. And one of the as yet untapped benefits of Brexit will be reforming the way that we protect nature. At the moment, we have this patchwork of all different kinds of protected sites, from triple SIs to national parks, all these different protected sites that people don't know what they mean, and developers don't know what rules that they have to comply to. All of this adds incredible complexity. One of the benefits of Brexit is we can simplify that system that, yes, allows us to better protect nature, but also allows us to crack on and build the infrastructure, the homes, the new sources of energy that we need. Because you're absolutely right, the Chinese are certainly not taking that approach.
Ryan, your response on that one?
Yeah, so in relation to China, I mean, it goes to Sam's point, I think, about how China is really driving forward with, the rare earth magnets that go into wind turbines, that they're driving forward with solar photovoltaics. That cannot be separated from the enormous fleet of coal plants, right? Yeah. Like, these two phenomenons are not antonyms, they're synonyms, right? You even have solar factories being located right next to gigantic coal plants in these enormous complexes. All right, if we were to take the China strategy to win these green industries, we'd still be using coal very liberally, essentially. These green industries, batteries, EVs, wind turbines, solar panels, they are incredibly energy intensive because it's ultimately about refining chemicals and metals at the cheapest possible price. It's congealed electricity, basically, and I think there's a reason that the dirtiest industrial provider is also the leader in these green spaces too.
Yeah. Karl, Pieter, any responses to that, and we will wrap up.
Well, yeah, so much to say. So indeed,
but with the point of China in particular in your mind, is what we're doing in Europe even relevant?
Well, you could say no, but even if you say we have to do our bit, then clearly we should not be ignoring the most obvious CO2 neutral energy source in the room, nuclear power, and that can sort of reconcile a low CO2 emission and and maintaining our living standards. And then, I mean, nobody really knows, but I would not be surprised if there's no place anymore then for these energy sources that only produce 4% of the world's energy, renewable energy, and that that ultimately only produce electricity. No wind and solar energy. Whereas for heavy industrial processes, you can't even use them. You still need gas. You need all these. Even coal sometimes.
Indeed, there's multiple uses of gas than just electricity. Carl, any final thoughts?
Well, just slightly to add to what Ryan was saying, every 3 years, China now burns as much coal as we've burnt cumulatively since the Industrial Revolution. We're responsible for 0.9% of global greenhouse emissions. China's what? I can't remember off the top of my head, 25, 40%, something mad. If we want to have the maximum impact on the climate crisis, global warming, whatever you want to call it, there are better ways we could be spending our money. That might be on R&D for the next generation of genuinely green technologies, where we do have a genuine comparative advantage still, and not trying to shave another 0.1% off emissions would be a better priority.
I just want to come in very
Absolutely,
quickly, very quickly. So, just on, I just want to make two final points. So, firstly, on China, yes, it is the case that they are still building out coal capacity, but it also is the case that they are building out more renewables and nuclear capacity than anyone else. And all major experts predict that their emissions are about to plateau this year and will steadily come down. So that trajectory is happening. And then the second point that I just wanted to frame as a question. Like, I have set out the argument for why I think that going hell for leather, making it as easy as possible to build new nuclear and new renewables, that is the way to energy security by the end of this decade. But I want to ask, what is the alternative plan? Because we know that the North Sea is a declining basin. We know that, with the best will in the world, I think that the idea that we could be energy independent on fracked gas in 5 years is a heroically optimistic assumption that even UK oil and gas, the onshore oil and gas lobby, say that by the end of the decade, maybe onshore gas can provide about 20% of our demand. There is a clear path to abundant energy, and it lies in making it easier to build the clean stuff, which we have expertise in and great resource in. I have yet to hear a better alternative plan.
So, our very esteemed panel, thank you very much today. I think it was a very interesting discussion. In the wider context, it's very intriguing that the views expressed by Sam and also, interestingly, Karl about developing the technologies which may well save the world in Britain with our comparative advantage seems to be an area where the more intelligent brains on the British left are coalescing with an interesting paper published by the Tony Blair Institute earlier this week, suggesting that maybe we shouldn't annihilate our own domestic economy, and instead we should look at how we develop the technologies which will save the world. But with that, so I'm going to bring everything to a close. I'd like to thank our panel and then say thanks to all of you for joining the 2024 Free Market Roadshow at Legatum Institute today and this year. This is the first time we've hosted a Free Market Roadshow event. Indeed, it's the first time Legatum Institute has really done much in the way of sort of interesting right-wing events. I hope you will have noticed that since the tenure of Dr. Radomir Tarka as managing director from last year, and my arrival as Director of Parliamentary Affairs, Legatum Institute has decided to increase its activity and research output and general interest in the future of conservatism, and taking on the role of convening all these people here today, working with the Adam Smith Institute, College Green Group and the Austrian Economic Centre to host the Free Market Roadshow is absolutely part of that. This is not just a talking shop. The whole point is to use what we have discussed here as a stepping stone, to use a term very much in vogue in the British right now, to develop the future conservative thinking for the next generation. So thank you all for coming. It was fantastic to hear such interesting speeches from Robert Jenrick, whose speech has already been covered in the Telegraph this afternoon. I'm pleased to say, and we'll be uploading footage of the fascinating debate between Dr. James Orr and Lord Hannan on national conservatism, Whiggish Toryism and liberal conservatism, and what is the future for the right in Britain and the West. And I was thought it was a wonderful presentation from Dr. Richard Rahn and Sir John Redwood, of course, on monetary policy, detailing both the complete idiocy of our central bankers and regulatory class and the need for greater democratic control, as Charles said, of not just monetary policy but our wider administrative state and institutions. That was one of the abiding themes throughout the entire day, that we have, that Parliament, our sovereign legislature, which has existed for nearly 800 years, has decided to legislate to hand its powers away to an appointed administrative class. The redemocratisation of the state in Britain only began with Brexit, but unfortunately Parliament, as it has currently constituted, has not delivered that. I think it's incumbent on everybody in this room, within even a passing interest in conservatism, to work towards the full restoration of British democracy and the democratisation of the state. So that means a proper, legitimate bonfire of the Quangos, hopefully the restoration of the Bank of England to democratic control, and of course putting the Competition and Markets Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority back in their boxes and telling them they cannot destroy the last remaining vestiges of innovation in the British economy. So thank you all for coming today. Please do join us for a drink in the anteroom outside. As the weather is terrible, you have no reason to leave. So please do have a drink on us for the next hour or so, and hopefully to see you at other events, whether it's Party Conference in October or anything else done in this wider world for the next year or so. Thank you very much.